on the News Channel 5 network. This is OpenLine.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to OpenLine. Glad you are with us tonight. It is Ask the Mayor. Happy to have with us Mayor David Briley. Mayor, thank you for being here.
Good to be here, man.
We are in the final days of the campaign, as you know.
We are. I think everybody's happy about that. Everybody's happy, right? You know.
What are you most focused on in these days before Election Day? How much is campaigning? How much is doing work? And what are you most focused on? What do you want voters to be most focused on?
Well, right now the big issue for us on the government side is the council's not in session, so we've got a little bit of a break there from doing the work of the council every single week or every other week. So we're just focusing on making sure government's running smoothly in the interim. When it comes to what folks ought to be most focused on, I'd suggest just a clear distinction between the two candidates. One with a history of working for people who live in Nashville on progressive issues, making hard decisions and moving the city forward, and one who has spent his adult life in Middle Tennessee as a real estate developer and is frankly making a lot of promises right now that can't be fulfilled. That's the basic sense of the difference. Being mayor is a lot of times about making difficult decisions, and I've had 18 months full of them, and look forward to another 4 years of moving the city forward.
Some of the polls that are out there now have you behind.
Sure.
Do you feel as though you're an underdog? Are you going into these final days as if you're an underdog?
Sure. I mean, I think that's been the focus for the last almost 6 weeks now, just focusing on getting the votes out, drawing the distinction, and clearly I'm the underdog. I think that's turned out to be the case because of the amount of money my opponent is willing to spend to be mayor of Nashville. And my guess is if it's not over $2 million by now, it'll soon will be. Even though we've raised significantly more in Nashville than he has. If you're willing to go in and spend a lot of your own money, you get a certain advantage, especially these days.
Now, just today, Councilman at Large Steve Glover is taking legal action on a recent executive order that you signed on immigration enforcement. Sure. He said the executive order violates state law and could cost Davidson County more than 1,000 jobs and millions of dollars. He held this news conference out in front of the courthouse today. What is your reaction to his filing that?
Well, first, it's entirely lacking in merit. I think there's Councilman Glover's representing himself on this, and I think the saying goes, any man who acts as his own lawyer has a fool for a client, and so I'd say that's a pretty apt proverb under these circumstances. That's a pretty generous way to look at it. I think more cynically, you might say that it's a waste of money for both the city and Mr. Glover. It's xenophobic, but it's not much of a surprise. I think that's how Councilman Glover's conducted himself during the majority of his tenure as a councilman.
Why did you sign the executive order? I guess tell us in your words, what is your goal with the executive order? Why did you sign it?
Sure. So if you look at what's going on in the country right now, looking particularly on immigration, I think anybody who believes the federal government is going to do anything about immigration is foolish. I've had plenty of times, no matter which side you're on, they're not doing anything when it comes to immigration. And the state isn't either. The state's actually making it worse by passing laws that tie the hands of local governments. In the city of Nashville, we have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of folks in Nashville who are either immigrants or refugees or family members of immigrants or refugees. And this HB 2315 really makes it harder for me to lead the city to take care of people who live here. I'll give you a good example, Ben. This year, just in the first few weeks of school, we had more than 2,000 new students who arrived who were English language learners. I'm told that most of them were from Guatemala and Honduras. Most of them came without their parents. Many of them came from detention. And HB 2315 makes it harder for me to make sure they get their vaccines. that they stay healthy. It makes it harder for me to make sure they get a good public education, as I'm obligated to do. It makes it harder for me to make sure that their families are willing to be witnesses when there's a crime that's been committed. And so as long as I'm mayor of the city of Nashville, when I'm confronted with those circumstances, I think it's important for me to step out, speak up, and try and protect the people who live here. That's especially became true in the last few weeks, couple of months, as ICE has ramped up their enforcement across the country, and we've had what I would call a couple of ill-trained or ill-acting ICE agents sort of roaming around our city, firing off weapons and causing concern in our communities. So the city of Nashville is a welcoming place, and we have got to do more and more to protect people in this community who are afraid to leave their homes, afraid to get public education, afraid to be witnesses in to crimes, because under those circumstances we're less strong. We're not doing what we need to do as a city. So that's what the executive order is all about.
Some questioned if it had anything to do with the proximity of the election. Would you have signed that if we weren't days away from the election?
Well, I'm not sure it helped me in the election, Ben. I think we received a whole lot of criticism from members of the community that we were doing it. I did it because it's the right thing to do for the city. Most of the people who think I did it for political reasons also don't like it. So I'm not exactly sure of the logic of all that. It's certainly something that was precipitated by the most recent events that have taken place in our city with ICE in increasing their enforcement here in the community.
We'll set the table here with just some questions, then we'll start taking calls. One of the big concerns we hear over and over is about the money, the money for the city, the budget. That's been a big issue in this campaign. There's been the comptroller's letter. In the debate, you call that a political document. The comptrollers seem to voice some concern about the cash flow and where we are financially.
Sure.
What do you say about where we are financially?
Sure. So it is a political letter. Virtually every circumstance that is mentioned in this year's letter existed last year too. Parking was in last year's budget as well. There was other one-time expenditures in last year's budget as well. Tax revenues were actually significantly up this year over last year. We made progress on all our balances, fund balances this year. And the fact that my opponent knew about the letter before I did sort of indicates that it was a political document. So I think that's pretty clear that that is the case. If you want to get a good objective assessment of where our finances are, as I've been saying for some time, we sold bonds to the private sector, to people all around the world. We got good ratings last year from Moody's, where they talked about the fact that the city had good leadership, had good finances, had a good tax base. That certainly, like every city around the country, will have challenges, but we got a high rating. Our ratings actually went up in many respects. My opponent in this election, despite the fact that he was the sponsor of the budget that created every single mess I've had to handle in the last 18 months, has proclaimed himself self-proclaimed master of all things budget. The only instance where we have had an opportunity to measure that objectively is the budget that he presented to that he sponsored at the council, which was frankly the worst budget the city's ever had. And so the city's finances are in good shape. I just got word today that for 2019 we're on track to have another record year of building permits. I know that adds some traffic to town, but it also adds a lot of tax revenue. So folks should understand that the budget is in good shape, that we certainly have challenges, and that happens when you keep the tax rate as low as we've kept it.
One of the things mentioned in the letter is the selling of parking rights enforcement, and that is counting on, the current budget counts on some money from that.
Sure.
I believe it's $30 million.
More or less.
And that's been postponed. You kind of put that off.
Sure.
If you won, would you bring that back up? There wasn't a ton of support for that in the council. What if that doesn't pass? How does this budget work without that $30 million?
Sure. So last year's budget had 15 million in it for parking as well, and we didn't pursue that last year either. And so we're clearly capable of navigating some changes in terms of revenue and expenses during the course of a year, and so we have the capacity to manage through circumstances like that for sure. And I think we're doing a letter back to the comptroller on the 20th of September as required, and so you'll get a little bit more clarity about exactly both how last year's budget ended up and about how we intend to manage through next year's. But I'm going to correct you about one thing. I mean, fundamentally, this is a modernization of our parking system. It is a long-term contract where we would be entering into an agreement with a private company, but it's a contract we can get out of at any time for any reason or no reason at all. And the idea behind it is that right now, if there were a Titans game tonight, if it were Monday Night Football, you'd probably pay $50 to park downtown if you lived in Nashville. If you were lucky or a tourist and happened to hit the spot at the right time on the street, you might not pay anything at all. By modernizing our parking system, if you live in Bellevue or Belmead or Antioch or Old Hickory, you'll be able to drive downtown and try and find a parking space on the street that doesn't cost $50. Might cost you $2 or $4 or $6 to park. That's the kind of modernization we need. Virtually every city around the country has already done this. We're way behind the curve in terms of getting it done. Just to give you a good example of that, the city of Chattanooga collects more in parking than the city of Nashville does. So there's a lot of work to be done on that. There was a whole lot of disinformation out there about what the parking modernization plan was going to do. I think it was motivated by the election, motivated by my opponent, and my guess is that he funded some of the disinformation that was out there about it. And so I think we get past an election, past the silly season, people have a chance to look at it concretely and see what is truly going to happen here, that there's not 5 miles of neighborhood parking that's rolling out there, that all the new parking would be downtown and in Midtown, and people will come to the conclusion that it's the right thing for the city to do. Now, if that's not the case and the council decides not to vote for it, I've proven in the last 18 months that I can manage us through a difficult budget season and still get pay raises to our employees. That's not something my opponents have proven that he's willing to or capable or able to do.
Another issue, and people can call in with questions. All right, this is saying you kicked up a controversy when you talked about a new high school in Bellevue should be delayed because other areas of the city, such as Antioch, are in more dire need of classroom space. Sure. Obviously, people in Bellevue didn't like to hear that.
Yeah.
What do you feel that way still? Do you feel like we should not that high school in Bellevue should be delayed? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I didn't say it should be. I said it could be, I think is the way I put it. Right now, if you look at the city comprehensively when it comes to utilization of our school buildings, there are 6 clusters that are under-enrolled: McGavock, Maplewood, Hunters Lane, Whites Creek, Stratford, and Pearlcombe. They last year had somewhere around 35,000 seats, and about 10,000 of them were empty. So they have a lot of vacancy in those schools. Second thing is, if you go to southeast Davidson County, Antioch and Cane Ridge, and a lot of the middle schools feeding those 2 high schools are overcrowded. We could use another high school, another middle school for sure in those areas. Bellevue Middle is going to be a $100 million investment. And so I don't think it's the right thing for our city to do to say we're going to build Bellevue without also taking care of these other issues. And so as I said in Bellevue at a meeting at the Exchange Club last Friday, I'd like to do both. But you certainly can't do that without raising the property tax rate. And so if we'll have a conversation as a community about whether or not we want to do both those things and look at the property tax rate. My opponent has both promised to do Bellevue and promised not to raise taxes. What that means is that southeast Davidson County is going to get left behind. That's just the fundamental truth of it all. I'd also like to see some progress from the school board in terms of utilizing what they've got as resources, because it doesn't make sense for us to have so many empty seats in so many schools unless they're doing well. And if you look at the schools that have most of the empty seats across the county right now, they're not, frankly, doing well. Many of them on the priority list. So there needs to be some work at the board to confront this. You know, where kids go to school, how close they are to their school is always a contentious issue. So I've proven in my record that I am willing to support the Bellevue High School. I put money in last year's capital spending plan for it. I just think we got to have a real honest conversation about equity in our public school system, about efficiency, and that's what I'm going to make sure we do. On the other hand, my opponent, who is now for Bellevue Middle School, has twice voted against the resources necessary to build it. It's pretty clear to me that in this election he's going to say whatever it takes to get over the finish line, in his opinion, in terms of getting the majority of the votes. People need to look closely at everything he's saying, because he's making a lot of promises and frankly is not going to be able to fulfill them all without the city's without a very large tax increase for the city, which he's also promising not to do.
And you've said you've been opposed to a tax increase the last 2 years.
I have.
Does that mean you're saying we need a tax increase in a year? Where does a tax increase come in the real world, not in campaign season?
Sure.
But here you are speaking as the mayor, also running for office. But isn't it realistic we're going to have a tax increase soon?
Well, the way I look at it is this. First, you can't take a tax increase off the table, and that's because of the way our system is structured. And every 4 years when we do a reappraisal, the rate gets reduced so that there's no net increase in property taxes collected. And that means that you're not keeping up with inflation if you do it for a long time. And inflation, adds up pretty quickly over time. So you don't take it off the table. Then you decide as a community, what do you need to do? And we know in the city of Nashville there's some things we need to do. We need to invest in our teachers, our firefighters. Got some things we need to do at the fire department. We know that on transportation and transit we've got to make some improvements. And I think the next phase is for us to get a more concrete idea about exactly what those mean. With teachers, police, and fire, we're in the process of doing a good pay study to look at what we need to do to get them in line. When it comes to transportation and transit, WeGo Transit is in the process of a better bus survey to look at how they can improve their service. We'll get all that back, look and see if with the revenue growth we'll have organically, without raising the rate, if there's enough money there to do it. If there's not, I've told teachers and police and fire that it's my belief that the people in the city of Nashville will be willing to do more, and I will present that to them with a compelling case about why we need to pay more in taxes to get those kind of things done. So that's the way I look at it. I think it's fundamentally flawed to say at the beginning, yes, we're going to raise taxes, or no, we're not going to raise taxes. What you have to do is bring the community together about what we need to do, explain to them why we would need more revenue to do it, and then go to them with the specifics of what the next step should be.
That kind of sets the table. We have to take a break. We're now opening up the phone lines. If you're on, hold on. We'll get to your call. If you want to call in, there are a couple lines open. That's the number at the bottom of the screen, 615-737-PLUS. 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.